Hello, everybody. Bob Oxley here. It's time for tips, topics, issues, and positions. And today we're going to be talking about what's going on with our state legislature, the Utah State Legislature, that's been in session now for about 12 days. A lot of things happening up there in Salt Lake City, and it's been my pleasure. I invited back Dr. Jeremy Young, who is the assistant professor of history at Dixie State University. And I understand that just in the last week has been told or informed, guess what? You're now the director of the Institute of Politics and Public Affairs.
It's true.
Welcome back.
I can't deny it. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Congratulations on your promotion or your add-on activity. On top of teaching and working with the students, now you're going to be working with students in the Institute. So I think it's great.
Thanks.
It's absolutely great.
A lot of exciting possibilities.
Absolutely. Well, here we are. We're 12 days into this part-time state legislature here in Utah. And right out of the gate, I've been approached by a number of our listeners and said, whatever you do when you're with Dr. Young, please talk about this Medicaid expansion situation. I thought that we voted on to expand it, and there was at the election booth last November, and now the legislature's in session, and they go into committee and they repeal Proposition 3. Can they legally do that? Is that what?
So initiatives are an interesting feature of state ballots. Obviously, there's no federal equivalent of an initiative, so it's only something that can be done at the state level. And a lot of voters assume that when an initiative passes at the state level, that means it is enshrined into law permanently and cannot be changed or adjusted at all. In fact, initiatives, unless it's a constitutional amendment, which this was not, initiatives are simply laws. They get passed in the same way that a law would be passed if it was passed through the legislature and signed by the governor, which means they can be repealed or changed by the legislature just like any other law. Now, voters, in fact, initiatives have to be changed. Almost always they have to be changed in some way because they have technical problems. In fact, even the supporters of this initiative recognize that it can't just be enacted exactly as written. There have to be some changes to technical provisions. But the question is, should the changes be purely technical, or should the changes involve substantial changes, which is, I think, what you're seeing more at the legislature. Now, in Arizona, there was a medical marijuana bill passed, and interestingly, a similar initiative passed in Utah this past cycle. And it was passed in 1996, and it was essentially completely repealed by the legislature in 97. So in 1998, in Arizona, the voters approved I believe a constitutional amendment called the I can't remember what it's called. I've forgotten the name off the top of my head. But in any case, what it provides for is that an initiative while it can be changed by the legislature, it has to reflect what's in quotes the intent of the voters. And that essentially allows initiative supporters to sue the state legislature if the legislature changes the point of the initiative, if they get rid of what the intent of the initiative was. Utah doesn't have a provision like that, so there's no way for Utah voters to ensure that their initiatives will be able to take effect, because they vote for the initiatives, but they vote for the legislators too. And if the legislators disagree with the initiatives or think they have problems, then they have the right to overturn them.
Wow. Well, carrying on, this came out of committee yesterday, a vote of 9-6 in favor of repealing Proposition 3. And there was debate back and forth, obviously, before the vote was taken on that, before it came out of committee. And some of the arguments they're saying that what they're preferring is that it would be 100% taking care of people that are at the poverty level. And there's all sorts of things going on, like there's a 90-10 ruling, and then there's a 25-75 ruling. I'm just really confused. It's very confusing. In other words, is the federal funds coming in to compensate that? We're seeing ads on the TV now that saying that if this continues on, we're going to alienate 50,000 people that deserve health care. Can you give us any insight on all that. I mean, it's so confusing.
It's a very complicated situation, and part of the reason it's complicated is because of the federal government involvement. I mean, under Obamacare, states were encouraged to expand Medicaid to cover many more people using a lot of federal funds, but those federal funds needed to have a state match. And the state match, that the state has to contribute less and less of the funds as basically in order to encourage the states to cover as many people as the federal government wanted to cover, the states would have to contribute fewer funds if they covered more people. So if they cover everyone the federal government wants to cover, they only have to pay 10% of that cost. If they cover a smaller amount, they have to cover 30%, and it decreases from there. The state, it's complicated because while the legislature has never been incredibly supportive of expanding Medicare very much, Medicaid has been, there's some support for expanding it a little bit among almost all legislators, but the legislature has never been a big fan of expanding it all the way. The governor has been more supportive of expanding Medicaid, but one of the things that they're arguing about, they would like to see a smaller expansion, which means, of course, that they get fewer matching funds. The initiative called for a full expansion. And the other thing is they would like to institute a work requirement to say that if you're getting Medicaid, you have to work. And that requires a waiver from the federal government. Now, other states have tried to get one of these. The Trump administration has said that they will provide these waivers, but so far they haven't really done so. And so the question is, if they pass a law that says Medicaid can't expand without this waiver, and then the federal government doesn't provide the waiver, then that will mean there's no expansion, at least in the short term. And because the legislature doesn't meet year-round, they wouldn't be able to expand it without the waiver again until next year, or if they called a special session before next year. So what I think the initiative has done is it has given some ammunition to people like the governor who want to pass a fairly substantial expansion, even if it's not the full expansion. It sort of nudged the conversation in the direction of expanding Medicaid, but the legislature doesn't want to expand it fully as the initiative called for.
Got it. So the big problem is it's not just our legislators that are confused. It's because we can't count on the federal government and what formula it is and getting access to those matching funds. And so before they make a commitment,
exactly, that's
the problem,
right? There's so many players here. There are Democrats in the legislature who have a lot of ammunition because of the proposition, which supported their position, but don't have a lot of votes. Then you have Republicans in the legislature who don't all agree with each other. You have the governor who doesn't agree with all of the legislative proposals. You have Obamacare, which lays out certain policies, and you have the Trump administration, which might provide waivers to those policies, but might not. So it's just a very complicated situation. The initiative would fully expand it and would take advantage of all the federal funding, but there's concern among Republican legislators that it might cost too much for the state. The initiative raised a sales tax to pay for the expansion, the state's portion of the expansion, but legislators are concerned that it wouldn't pay for all of it.
And then that's what I heard in one of the arguments. They actually had the number. I think that we had a surplus, fortunately, for the state of Utah of $800 billion, something like that. And they took that number and expanded it with full expansion on Medicaid and how long it would last before we would be in deficit spending, and that's the big concern also.
I think it's $800 million is the surplus.
$800 million,
but yes, if we had $800 billion, we could do
everything. Yeah, I'm thinking about Amazon and fancy.
Oh yeah, we could put helipads in the Bears Ears National Monument if we had $800 billion.
So that's one issue. I think you've given a great explanation because it's so complex and it is very confusing, even with the ads coming on, both pro and con. Very confusing. So you can see why some of the concern from the various perspectives on the state legislature and the governor also.
Right.
Okay.
And those ads are so confusing. That's why I don't have cable television.
All right. I've got something else we're talking about up there in Salt Lake during this session is a tax cut.
Right.
Okay. The governor said a tax cut, but then all of a sudden what I'm seeing and what we're hearing coming out of there, they're on the side looking at other new areas that possibly could be taxed for the very first time, and also looking at potentially increasing the tax levels of other areas that are currently being taxed. So my question to you, Dr. Young, is that and I'm just the little guy here spending money. I get a tax cut, but then all of a sudden then I go to use some of these services that I've grown accustomed to,
Right.
and it's cost more. So it's eating up that little bit of a tax cut that I got. So why are they doing this?
So the real question, what's really being debated here, is what type of taxes each side prefers, and that's really the question. It's not is there going to be an overall tax cut, but is there going to be are they going to cut certain types of taxes and replace some of that revenue with other types of taxes? So generally speaking, and this is a very big generalization, it doesn't apply to every legislator or every voter, but generally speaking, Democrats prefer so-called progressive taxes, that is, taxes that hit people who can afford to pay them harder than people who can't afford to pay them. The income tax is a classic example of a progressive tax because it progressively, as the wealthier you get, the more you're taxed. Property taxes are a form of progressive tax. Republicans, on the other hand, tend to prefer taxes that are more based on individual choices, things like sales taxes, things like excise taxes, taxes on luxury goods, because they feel that that gives people the ability to choose whether they're willing to pay it, whether they're willing to do something that will result in them paying a tax. And so what I think, I haven't followed this in as much detail as I should have, but the sense I get is that Republicans are talking about cutting some income taxes and replacing them with some sales taxes and some other types of taxes, and that would make sense, consistent with the Republican philosophy on how taxes should be handled.
So we won't see any deficit. We'll see any loss as a result of a tax cut. The citizens of Utah will be happy because they got a tax cut, but we're going to see increases in certain areas.
Right. So from a Republican perspective, if you get an income tax cut, something that you don't really have control over, you're not going to not get a job, so you don't have to pay income tax. So you get an income tax cut, and then you go out and you buy, a boat, and you have to pay a lot of sales tax on that boat. Then that's better because you've made the decision to buy this luxury good, a good that you're choosing to buy, and you're paying tax in that way rather than paying tax on something that you can't get out of.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Sure.
You're clarifying a lot here today, so I appreciate it. Okay, you ready for another one?
Sure.
Let's take a look at, the governor is really hot on this one, air quality. That inversion is really a real negative, especially those people up in Salt Lake City. And we down here in St. George are concerned also because we have this projected population growth, and we don't want to make those same mistakes. He's encouraging the legislature to pass different bills and proposals that will take on this air quality issue. Is there from a pure political standpoint, is there a pro from a Democratic side and a opposition from the Republican side, or do we have a mix? Or
I think it's a fairly muddled situation. Everyone agrees that the inversion is a serious problem. It causes health problems for a lot of people. It contributes to serious medical expenses that cost everyone, individuals and the state, a lot of money. The question is, what exactly do you do to fix it? And so the concern is that a lot of the inversion gets created by corporate pollution, factory pollution, things like this. And Republicans would prefer a solution that didn't involve having to close a bunch of factories. That's not, get rid of a bunch of jobs. That's not the Republican approach to doing this. It's not entirely clear from a scientific perspective, at least as I understand it, what plans there are that wouldn't involve some kind of financial loss on the business end to do this. And there's also some debate over this inland port project, which seems to be a business expansion in Salt Lake that may or may not contribute to the smog, depending on which side you ask. So there's broad agreement that something has to be done about the inversion. It's a lot of smog. It's a lot worse in Salt Lake than it is in cities twice, 3 times the size of Salt Lake. But it's not entirely. There's a lot of debate over how to solve the problem, I think.
Okay, and the governor's already expressed that. He said,
"Right,
come up, give me some ideas." Give me something for us to get our arms around, because he wants this implemented right away.
And I think the concern is that if they can't agree on some kind of a solution, and honestly, Democrats don't have the votes in either chamber of the legislature to force their position, but Republicans don't all agree on what needs to be done here. If they can't agree on some kind of solution, then the smog just gets worse. Everyone agrees something needs to be done. It's kind of like Brexit. Everyone agrees something needs to be done, but they can't agree on what it should be, and so nothing's getting done.
Got it. All right. I've got another one for you.
Sure.
Here we go. Education in the state of Utah.
Right.
Governor's really wants to take this off too. Actually, he needs new approvals and needs, especially in rural areas in Utah. He's not happy with the numbers coming in and some of the surveys that have been taken on the parts of students and their reading abilities and science abilities and things of that sort. What have you heard as far as the state legislature on this? Are we moving forward? Great ideas, or are we on hold?
I've been hearing a lot of things in terms of education funding coming out of the state legislature, and I'm not entirely sure what's going on. I've been reading news stories that suggest that there's $1 billion sitting in an education fund that hasn't been used and isn't going to be used for education. People saying that that's not true. I'm not sure. I've been hearing people. One thing that did happen is there was a plan to increase a sales tax or actually increase a sales tax to pay for roads that would replace money that was being used to pay for roads to take and let that money go to pay for schools instead. That was initially an initiative on the ballot in 2018, and then through a compromise with the legislature, it got replaced with a question simply asking whether voters would be willing to support something like that, and the voters voted it down. So that really took a lot of the wind out of the sails of people who want to give more money for education because the voters didn't really approve that. But then, and I think the governor is really zeroing in on sort of merit-based approaches to teaching, sort of school reform approaches, basing things on test scores, basing things on outcomes, which a lot of teachers would argue is not the best way to measure outcomes through standardized testing. But the governor is not happy with the way the tests are working, and he's considering a lot of different options for what to do about that. Some of which involve money, some of which don't.
And his concern is legitimate. He said. Because they're trying to incent new companies to coming to our area, and they're going to look at the educational levels and those numbers. Even though you don't agree with those numbers will give some kind of an indicator. And plus, when we're measured against other states in the union, that's really upsetting to him.
Well, and I think there's broad agreement on both parties and all parts of the Republican Party that there's work to be done on the K through 12 education system in Utah. It's just how to measure it and what to do with it. This is state government 101. It's everyone agrees that there are things that need to be fixed, but if they can't agree on how to fix them, then they won't get fixed.
Got it. So. All right. Here's another one for you. Just was in committee and some of the proposals they're looking at as far as abortion's concerned, and on mongoloid pregnancies. Whether to, I guess the proposal yesterday that came out was, and the debate's just begun, whether or not to make it unlawful to have an abortion for a mongoloid depicted pregnancy. Do you have any information on that at all?
You're going to have to remind me what they mean by a mongoloid pregnancy.
Yeah, they're indicating that there's some kind of a psychological problem or identified problem with the the fetus itself, and so that would be a justification, and they want to make it a strong law that is indeed in the state of Utah unlawful. So
that you can't abort for issues of mental deficiency. You can only abort for medical necessity.
Yes.
Right. I mean, I think that's. I mean, there laws like that have been passed in other states, and I think they've for the most part been. I mean, some of them have been upheld, some of them have not. But the real question is, with the new Supreme Court, what's going to happen? And that's a big question. The Supreme Court having, in theory, 5 justices now who are not supportive of Roe v. Wade. Is there going to be sort of erosion of those of abortion rights stemming from that decision? And the decision that just came out yesterday indicates maybe not. Justice Roberts voted with the 4 liberal justices and upheld or struck down a measure that in Louisiana that was going to erode some of those protections. And so it's not clear whether or not bills like this will be upheld in Congress, but there's certainly a big push in a lot of conservative states in particular to pass bills of this type, bills restricting abortion in various ways, to see if they'll stand up now with the new court.
Yeah, I was surprised with Chief Justice Roberts' vote on that. There was going to, I think, Louisiana. The proposal was they'd close all of the abortion clinics except for one in the entire state. So
right, and Justice Roberts, I mean, he's a politician. He certainly has a brilliant legal background, but he worked his immediate background before becoming a federal judge was he worked on George W. Bush's 2000 presidential campaign as an attorney and as a political staffer. And so then he became a federal judge and then very quickly a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And I think that political background has led him, and this is my speculation, but I think it's led him to feel that it's important for the court not to make decisions that will erode the court's legitimacy. So he's the kind of judge, even if he doesn't support Roe v. Wade, he would rather sort of nibble away at the edges of it rather than have a big decision that strikes it down or something like that. You know, he wasn't willing to support a decision striking down Obamacare. He wasn't, even though Anthony Kennedy, who was at the time a more moderate justice than Roberts, was willing to vote for that. He wasn't willing to. He's been unwilling to pass a variety of. Other than Citizens United and the Hobby Lobby decision, he's been unwilling to participate in a lot of very highly sought after by conservatives decisions. So I think that it's possible that may continue. And in fact, we've seen Justice Kavanaugh, who also has a political background, make some moves like that as well, although he didn't in this case. So I think it's not as clear as it might have seemed during the Kavanaugh hearings that that Roe v. Wade is simply going to disappear. But I certainly think it'll continue to be chipped away at.
Yeah, I think the Kavanaugh's write-up on this, his statement indicated that this is a temporary.
Right, Kavanaugh said he'd support it, but he wanted to see if it created a hardship and then maybe strike it down later. So he too is not fully willing to go there with the other conservatives, Alito, Thomas, and and Gorsuch are certainly willing to strike these things down, but those two maybe not.
Leave your options open.
Right, definitely.
And people think they're all legal minds, brilliant legal minds, but boy, the politician is coming out. I
think it's useful to have politicians on the Supreme Court sometimes because they have a sense of what is feasible and what is not in a particular political climate. So I appreciate I don't think every judge should be a politician, but I appreciate having one or two on there. Sandra Day O'Connor had a political background too when she was on the court, and I think she used that to great advantage. That's
fantastic. I'm going to bring the next state legislature concern, because we're talking monies here.
Sure.
We're going to bring it down to our campus here at Dixie State University.
Okay.
We've got a proposal for a brand new Science and Technology Center, a gorgeous building that's requiring a little over $40 million. And my understanding is the state legislature is taking a look at that, and I think we're number 2 as far as priorities are concerned, is the way they work up there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Based on your knowledge of the way the state legislature is operating today, do you think that we may have some good news here in about a month?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think that building is very needed. I mean, our science building is it's been well used over the years. It's older. It doesn't have the lab space or the lab setups that our science courses and professors and students really need. I've seen the blueprints for the building. It looks beautiful. It's exactly what a campus like ours requires. So I certainly hope that it works. I can't speak for the legislature.
Yeah, state of the art everything.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. No, so we're going to have the Performance Center opening up in the fall and maybe breaking ground, hopefully, if the state legislature loves us like we all know they do here at Dixie State University.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Unfortunately, I said this time would fly by.
Oh, yeah.
I just got the high sign. So I really want to thank you, Dr. Young, for coming into the studio today and explaining a lot of confusing things. That Medicaid expansion is so confusing, and you really did a great job, and you really helped out a lot of our listeners really try to understand the complexity of making a decision. It's not just one side or the other. There's a lot of variables involved there.
Well, thanks. And I don't envy the state legislators having to sort through all this complexity. It's a tough job, and I think they do it well.
And I think based on everything how you've explained these different issues and different things, the proposals that are looking at, I think that the listeners now are aware that this is a very, very complex job.
Oh, very much
so.
And
it takes a lot, and trying to please their respective constituencies as well as moving forward for the state of Utah and all of our citizens here in the state.
Great. Thanks for having me on, Bob. Appreciate it.
I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule. And now, since you're now the director of Institute of Politics and Public Affairs, wow, I'm looking forward to seeing some of that activity, those events coming up.
Oh, yeah. We have a Pizza and Politics series that meets every other Thursday at noon in the Gardner Center living room. So watch for descriptions of those events coming out soon. We have one coming up in a week.
Fantastic. We will. Thanks again. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tips, topics, issues, and positions for another week. You can listen to us at 3 o'clock on Fridays and rebroadcast at 5 o'clock on Saturdays on KDXI 100.3. Or if you want to take a look at the smiling face of Dr. Young, we're available on Facebook, Twitter, even Alexa. You just say Radio St. George Tips and ask for the 2019 Utah Legislative, and it'll come up and you'll hear our wonderful voices and take a look at Dr. Young once again. Again, I want to thank you. Hope to hear from us next week. Tune in at 3 o'clock on Friday, and we'll have another topic, an issue, and some positions. Until that time, please have a safe and enjoyable weekend. Bye now.